Watch where you're standing, little lady. This is a warship, not a tour boat." The voice came from a young man in a working uniform, broad through the shoulders, a swim buddy on either side of him. He said it loud, so it would carry, and then he swept his hand and knocked the clipboard from the woman's grip. The papers went up into the jet wash and scattered across the non-skid like startled gulls, and the young man laughed. His name was Zane Corbett. He was 27 years old, a special warfare operator first class riding the carrier through workups, and he had decided, in the way of men who need an audience, that the quiet woman in the blue windbreaker was the funniest thing on the flight deck that morning. She did not flinch. That was the first thing, though no one but one man noticed it yet. A tourist flinches. A civilian who has never stood on 4.5 acres of steel moving through the Pacific throws up her hands and shrinks. This woman only turned her head, followed the arc of her scattered papers with a flat and unhurried gaze, and then knelt to gather them. She did not chase them. She waited for the deck to bring them to her, the way the deck always does, and she picked them from the non-skid one at a time while the turbines howled 40 feet away. She wore a plain blue windbreaker over a plain shirt, and her hair was regular length, gray going to white, tucked back out of the wind. Her hands were steady. She read the deck the way a sailor reads weather, not with fear, but with attention, the whole of it taken in at a glance and filed. When she stood, she did not look at Corbett the way a frightened woman looks at the man who frightened her. She looked past him, at the parked jets, at the foul lines, at the yellow-shirted director walking a Hornet toward the catapult, and she stepped, without hurry, without being told, exactly one pace to her left, out of a fuel line's path that no one had called yet. Corbett took her silence for a victory. He rolled his shoulders and grinned at his buddies. One of them, a leaner man named Cody Pratt, 24, a second class, had his phone up and turned sideways, filming, narrating under his breath for whatever group chat would love it later. "The tour guide," Pratt said, and laughed at his own joke. "You lost, ma'am?" Corbett said. He crowded closer, put a flat hand to her shoulder, and drove her back a half step until her spine met the deck-edge catwalk rail. "Skipper's mast is that way. Sightseeing's over." Sailors in colored jerseys glanced over, the reds of ordnance, the purples of fuel, the browns of the plane captains, and then, in the way of busy people who do not want trouble, glanced away again. The deck had 1,000 things to do before the afternoon, and no time for a joke going sour. Corbett had been aboard 11 days. He and his troop were riding the carrier from one coast to a workup off another, guests on somebody else's ship, and Corbett had spent the 11 days deciding, quietly and without ever saying it, that the ship's company were lesser men, deckhands, wrench-turners, people who serviced the war he fought. It is a small poison, and common in young men who have been told too early that they are the tip of the spear. He had never once considered that the deck under his boots was run by people who had been doing dangerous work with their hands since before he could shave, or that the quiet ones were often the ones worth fearing. He had decided the woman in the windbreaker was scenery, and he was a man who did not revisit his decisions. At the base of the island, where the deck's whole choreography could be read at once, a man in a float coat stood very still. His name was Silas Rourke. He was 53, a master chief, the flight deck handler, and he had spent 30 years learning to see the one thing on a deck that was wrong before it killed somebody. He was not looking at Corbett. He was looking at the woman, at the economy of that half step she had taken, at the way she had cleared the fuel line before it was fouled, at the set of her shoulders against the rail. Something in it reached back through his years and closed a cold hand around the back of his neck. "I know that walk," Rourke said, to no one. He did not move, not yet. But he did not look away either. The woman brushed a fleck of grit from the top sheet of her clipboard, squared the papers, and said nothing at all. Behind her, a hornet came off the number 3 wire of memory and into the present as the director walked it past, and she pivoted a quarter turn to keep it in her sight without seeming to try, the way you keep track of something that has tried to kill you before. Corbett laughed again and turned to his friends, certain he had won. He had not won. He had simply not yet been told what he had done. The deck did not slow for him. It never does. A carrier flight deck at sea is the most dangerous 40,000 square feet on Earth, and it runs on 1,000 small acts of attention performed in exact order, and the woman in the blue windbreaker moved through it now, as if she were reading a language she had spoken all her life. She stepped over a tie-down chain without looking down. She stopped at the edge of a jet blast deflector a beat before it came up, feeling the change in the deck through her boots. A young blue shirt named Wade Trumbull, 19, a tie-down man on his first cruise, watched her clear a turning hornet a full second before the director's wand came up, and frowned, because tourists did not do that. Tourists got yelled at. This woman was never in anyone's way. Corbett, needing more, drifted back into her orbit. "You even know what you're looking at, sweetheart," he said. "Or you just like the noise?" She answered without turning her head, in a few quiet words, and every word was exact. "Your fuel line's fouling the 6-pack, she said. "Somebody should call it before the next launch." Corbett blinked. He did not know what the 6-pack was. Pratt lowered his phone half an inch, and 10 feet away, a purple shirt keyed his radio, and a director's voice came across the deck, calling the exact foul the woman had named, and the line was cleared, and none of the SEALs understood how she had seen it first, except to feel, for a half-second, that the ground had shifted very slightly beneath them. It wasn't luck, and it was not a documentary. It was 30 years of a particular kind of attention. There are people who look at a flight deck and see chaos, jets and men and hoses and noise, all of it churning without pattern. And there are a very few who look at the same deck and see a clock. Every man in his place, every aircraft in its cycle, every hazard rising and falling in a rhythm you can feel through your boots if you have felt it 10,000 times before. The woman in the windbreaker was reading the clock. She had read decks like this one from above, in the groove on final at night, and from on them, walking a jet to the cat as a nugget, and from the ready room, and from the tower, and from the left seat of command. There was no zone of that deck she had not lived in. To her, the morning was not chaos. It was a language, and she was fluent, and the young man shouting at her had learned perhaps 100 words of it, and thought that made him native. Rourke understood. Rourke had drifted 20 feet closer now, studying her face against a memory he could not quite make surface. He caught the sleeve of the embarked liaison officer passing with a coffee, and asked, low, who the civilian observer on the deck was. The lieutenant frowned at his manifest, thumbed to a line, and said the name on it was a placeholder. A safety rider. TBD. Cleared aboard by the strike group staff. Cleared by the staff. Rourke's unease climbed another rung. Corbett, meanwhile, had found his footing again, and was rebuilding his morning at the woman's expense, louder now, for the knot of buddies gathering to watch. Lucky guess, he told them. Probably heard it on a documentary. He mimed her flat calm badly. His friends laughed because he was one of theirs, and she was no one. Rourke stared at the back of the woman's gray-white head, and a word came up out of him that he had not said aloud in 17 years. A call sign spoken so quietly it was lost in the wind. And he could not have told anyone why it had surfaced, only that his heart was suddenly beating the way it had beat the night a jet came home on fumes, and would not, by any law of physics he trusted, have made it back at all. By the time the sun was full over the deck, Corbett's joke had become a small gravity of its own, and men fell into it. 3 of his swim buddies orbited the woman now, and Pratt narrated for the camera as though he were a nature guide, and she were the wildlife. They gave her the nickname and passed it around, the tour guide, and each time it landed, one of them barked a laugh, and the woman in the blue windbreaker kept walking her deck as if she could not hear them at all. She could hear them. She heard everything. She simply had, a long time ago, learned the difference between noise that matters and noise that does not, and these young men were noise that did not. It is a thing you learn in a cockpit, where the radio never stops, and half of what comes across it is fear dressed up as chatter, and where the skill that keeps you alive is the skill of hearing the one call that matters through all the calls that do not. She had learned it young and paid for it in installments over 3 deployments, and it had made her, by the age most people are still deciding what they want to be, a woman who could stand inside a storm of contempt and feel nothing move in her that she did not choose to let move. The SEALs thought her calm was slowness. They thought a woman who did not fire back was a woman who could not. They had it exactly backward. Her calm was the calm of someone who had held the trigger on far worse than them and knew the weight of it, and knew that the measure of a person is not how fast they draw, but how long they can stand not to. Corbett could not stand being unheard. He stepped in and kicked her clipboard clean out of her hands a second time, and when she bent for it, he shouldered past her hard, driving her off the tie-down point she was stepping over, and she caught herself with one flat hand on the deck and rose again without a sound. A ripple went through the watching sailors, the ordnance men, the fuel men, the plane captains, a flinch of collective discomfort, quickly buried in work. This was not funny anymore, but no one wanted to be the one to say so. Trumbull, the young blue shirt, felt the words rise in his throat. "Hey, knock it off, she's not doing anything," and felt them die there, crushed flat under the weight of the crowd and the rank of the man making the crowd laugh. He looked at his boots. He would remember that later, longer than he wanted to. It is one of the quiet cruelties of a crowd that it makes cowards of decent people. Trumbull was a decent person. On his own, one-on-one, he would have stepped between the woman and the SEAL without a second thought, because his mother had raised him that way, and the Navy had not yet unraised him. But a crowd has a gravity, and the gravity said, "Stay small, stay quiet, don't be the one." And Trumbull was 19. And 11 months into a Navy that felt very large, and the gravity won. He hated it even as it won. He would spend a long time afterward wondering how many of the men around him were feeling the exact same thing at the exact same moment, all of them held in place by their certainty that they were the only one. A whole crowd of decent people, each one alone, letting a wrong go on because no one wanted to be first. Rourke had seen enough. He crossed to a deck phone at the island base, keyed it, and spoke fast and low to the tower, not naming her yet, because he could not yet believe the name, but flagging it hard. "Get eyes on the flight deck, forward of the island. Now, there's a situation with the embarked SEALs and the civilian rider, and it is about to be a problem. If you have ever watched the young forget what the old once paid, stay with this one, and subscribe to the Veteran Vault." Across the deck, the woman looked up, not at Corbett. She lifted her flat, unreadable gaze past him, past the island, up to the flag bridge high on the superstructure where the strike group staff kept their watch. And she held it there a moment, the way a person measures time against something only they can see. Then she looked back down at her clipboard and went on. It stopped being a joke a few minutes later, when Corbett decided that a woman who would not react needed to be moved. He came at her from the side and seized her by the upper arm, his whole hand closing around it, and he began to haul her toward the deck-edge catwalk. "Civilians don't belong up here," he said. "Off my deck." he said. My deck, the way boys say things they have not earned. And here was the strangest thing, the thing Pratt's camera caught and could not explain. The woman did not stumble. A person yanked sideways by a stronger person staggers, fights for balance, grabs. She did none of it. She went with the pull, weight centered, feet sure under her, as if she had been hauled around by larger and angrier men on worse decks than this, and had learned, decades ago, exactly how to stay standing. He planted her at the head of the ladder and pointed down it. "Below," he said. "Now." She met his eyes then, for the first time all morning, and said only quietly, "You might want to be certain who you're touching." Corbett laughed. It was the laugh of a man who has never once in his life been wrong about who had the power in a room. "Or what?" he said. "You'll write me up on your clipboard?" Around them, the deck kept its eyes down. A chief found something to inspect on a Hornet's landing gear. 2 junior officers turned, together, toward the island and walked. Trumbull stared at the toes of his boots and hated himself in a small, clean way he would carry for years. It is an old cowardice, and it is not special to any deck. The many who see and look away and leave the wronged to stand alone. But one man was done looking away. Rourke abandoned his post, a thing a flight deck handler does not do, and strode across the non-skid with his face gone to stone. He caught a chief by the shoulder as he passed and said, low and flat, "Get the boss. Get him now." And in that moment, as Corbett's hand tightened on her arm, something in the woman's eyes changed. It was there for a single frame, and then it was gone. Not fear and not anger, but a kind of terrible readiness, old and precise, and entirely without heat, surfacing from very far down, and then folding itself away again, deliberately, the way a person sheathes a knife they have decided not to use. It was there and gone, that readiness, faster than the eye could hold, and only 2 people on the deck were equipped to have seen it for what it was. One was Rourke. The other was the woman herself, who had felt it rise and had put it down the way you put down a tool you have decided you will not need, cleanly, without regret. She had made that decision so many times over so many years that it no longer cost her a visible thing. But it cost her something all the same. It always does. The strong pay a tax, the weak never see. And they pay it in the moments they choose not to use what they have. Rourke reached them and put himself between the woman and the ladder. "Take your hand off her, petty officer," he said. "You have no idea who that is." Corbett laughed in his face, because to Corbett, the world was simple and legible, and this was an old chief making a fuss over a civilian with a clipboard. "Relax, Master Chief. She's a tourist. I'm doing you a favor getting her off the deck." Rourke did not look at Corbett. He was looking at the woman, and when he spoke again, it was to her, quietly, the noise of the deck closing them into a small and private space. "I was on the crew," he said, "the night a Hornet came home on this class of deck, in 9, streaming fuel and half its skin, that had no business making it back. I was a young man on the roof, and we pulled the pilot out, and I have thought about that night every year since." He swallowed. "I know your face, ma'am. I've known it for 20 minutes and been afraid to say it." Her eyes answered before her mouth did. There was no drama in it. She simply held his gaze and gave one small nod, and Rourke felt the deck tilt under him, and his spine straightened a fraction on an instinct 30 years deep, the instinct that snaps a sailor to attention, checked, only just, by the fact that she was standing there in a windbreaker with a clipboard, refusing to make anyone bow. Rourke turned his head and sent word up the chain, to the island, to the flag bridge, that the incoming commanding officer was on the flight deck, in civilian clothes, and there was a situation, and it needed rank on the roof immediately. Corbett heard the words, "Incoming commanding officer," and did not let them land, because they did not fit the morning he had built. Embarrassed by the old chief's intensity, feeling his audience waver, he did the one thing that would finish him. He doubled down. He stepped back to the woman, chest out, playing to his buddies, and said, "Yeah? She doesn't look like anybody's captain to me." What the young man in the pressed uniform did not know is what the next few minutes would teach him. Subscribe so you do not miss it. High on the flag bridge, a phone was set gently back into its cradle. Below it, in the tower, an aide reached for the 1MC handset and waited, one beat, for the word. And on the deck, the woman in the blue windbreaker simply stood, patient as weather, and waited too. To understand what Corbett had put his hands on, you have to leave the deck and the morning and go back 17 years to a valley in Afghanistan at night, where a jet was rolling in through fire it should not have survived. She was 28 then, a lieutenant, and the fleet knew her by her call sign, Vesper. It was the last hour of a long night, and a special operations team was pinned in the bottom of a valley, with the walls above them alive with muzzle flash. Danger close. The enemy so near the friendlies that any weapon dropped wrong would kill the men it was meant to save. The team was minutes from being overrun. The voice on the radio calling for help was very calm, which is how you know it is very bad. 800 meters. Danger close. She rolled in anyway. Her wingman rolled with her, a lieutenant named Gideon Frost, 26, a quiet man with a wife and a baby he had met exactly twice, who flew her wing the way good wingmen do, as if he were bolted to her jet. They came down into the valley low, through anti-aircraft fire that turned the dark into a strobe, threading between the walls, and on the first pass, Vesper broke the assault off the trapped team's left flank, close enough that the men on the ground felt the heat of it through their gear. She pulled off, racked the jet around in the black, and rolled in again. And again. She flew that valley the way you would walk into a burning house for someone you loved, over and over, because each pass bought the team, on the ground, another handful of seconds to live. There is a thing they teach you, and a thing they do not. They teach you the geometry of a danger-close run, the angles, the fusing, the distances, the cold arithmetic of how near you can put a weapon to men you are trying to save without killing them yourself. They teach you the numbers until the numbers are in your hands. What they do not teach you, because it cannot be taught, is the thing that makes you press the fourth pass when every instrument and every instinct is telling you to climb out and go home. That thing is not courage exactly. Courage is for a single moment. This was something you had to renew, pass after pass, each time from nothing, each time knowing better, and choose again. Vesper chose it 4 times that night. The men in the valley did not know her name. They knew only that the sky above them, which had been full of death, was now full of someone who would not leave. On the 4th pass, the fire found Frost. She saw it happen off her right wing, a flash where a jet had been, and then no jet, and then a hard voice in her headset that was her own voice saying his name, once, and then a discipline older than grief, taking the controls back. His jet did not come off the ridge. There was no time to look for it, no time to mourn it, because the team on the ground was still alive and still calling, and she was the only thing left in the sky over them. So she stayed. She covered their exfil alone, her own airframe streaming damage now, a warning panel lit up like a city, and she flew until the last man was out of the valley, and the calm voice on the radio said the words that meant they would live. Then she turned for the sea and found out what her jet had left to give her, which was almost nothing. She brought it back in the dark onto a moving deck with a fuel state that the men in the tower read twice because they did not believe it the first time, and an airframe that groaned. She caught the wire on the first pass because there would not have been fuel for a second, and the deck crew swarmed the jet, and a young sailor named Silas Rourke, who had not yet gone gray, got a hand on the canopy rail and helped haul the pilot out. He remembered, forever, the look on her face when the canopy came up. She was not crying. She was staring at nothing, at the middle distance, at the place in the dark, where the number 2 jet should have been, and was not. 43 men had walked out of that valley alive. Her wingmen had not walked out of the sky. They gave her the Silver Star for that night. She already wore the Distinguished Flying Cross from a valley the year before. She wore both of them the way she wore everything after, quietly, without a word, as a debt more than an honor. And the sailor on the deck who pulled her out carried the image of her face for 17 years, until a morning came when a woman in a blue windbreaker turned exactly a quarter turn to keep a hornet in her sight, and the whole night came back and stood up in him at once. She went to see Frost's wife when the deployment ended. She sat in a small kitchen in a small house and told a young widow the truth, which was that her husband had died, flying wing on a run that saved 43 men, and that he had not hesitated, not for a heartbeat, because he was the finest wingman she had ever flown with, and he had known exactly what the pass would cost, and had rolled in beside her anyway. She held the baby, who was too young to know anything, and she made a promise to that child in her own head that she never spoke aloud, that she would spend the rest of her career making the sky worth what Frost had paid for it. That promise was the engine under everything that came after. The Top Gun tour, where she made better pilots than herself, the squadron command, the screening from Major Command, and the orders, at last, to take a carrier of her own. People looked at her record and saw ambition. It was not ambition. It was a debt, being paid in the only currency it could be paid in over 17 years, and it had brought her, this morning, to the deck of the ship she had come to command. The young Rourke's hand on the canopy rail, Vesper's eyes fixed on nothing. That was the picture. And now, on the sunlit deck of the ship she had come to command, the picture snapped into place around the calm old woman the SEALs had been laughing at all morning. And Rourke knew, past any doubt, exactly who Corbett had just called nobody's captain. Back in the light and the noise of the present, Corbett needed one more thing to reset the morning in his favor, and the thing he chose was to reassert himself over the meddling old chief in front of everyone, with the only argument he had ever really trusted. He shoved her. It was a hard, flat, two-handed shove to the shoulders, the kind that ends fights, and it sent the clipboard flying a second time and rocked the woman back into the deck-edge rail. And then Corbett laughed, the same laugh from the top of the morning, the title laugh, the laugh that would play on Pratt's camera later in a very different silence. And he held it one beat too long. The woman righted herself off the rail. She was not hurt. She came off it centered, balanced, her feet already under her, and for one held frame the whole of what she was rose up behind her eyes. A lifetime of reflexes that could have ended the young man where he stood before his buddies, finished their next breath. And she looked at it, and she set it down. She had spent a lifetime deciding when to strike. This was not the moment. It never had to be. The deck felt it. Rourke's hand came up, flat, a warning to everyone and no one. Hold. Trumbull, the young blue shirt, finally stepped half a pace forward, his whole body deciding something. And the knot of SEALs around Corbett went quiet by degrees, sensing, the way animals sense a change in pressure, that the ground under their friend had become something else while they were laughing. They could not have said what had changed. Nothing visible had. The woman had not raised her voice or lifted a hand. She had only come off the rail and stood. But there is a kind of stillness that reads, to anyone with the instincts to feel it, as far more dangerous than any motion. The stillness of a thing that could move and has decided, for now, not to. And the young men around Corbett felt it now for the first time, a cold draft off the woman they had spent the morning mocking. One of them, without quite meaning to, took a step back. Pratt had stopped narrating. Somewhere in the animal part of each of them, a small voice was saying the thing their friend was too loud to hear, that they had misjudged something badly, that the joke had never been the joke they thought it was, and that whatever was about to happen was already too late to stop. High in the tower, the aide keyed the ship-wide circuit, and it went hot with a small electric click that no one on the deck could hear over the wind. Corbett straightened his blouse and squared his shoulders, victorious in the only country he had ever lived in, the one behind his own eyes, as the first shrill note of the boatswain's pipe cut across the entire ship. The pipe froze the deck. It came out of every speaker at once, that old silver call, and then the 1MC, the voice of the ship herself, filled the air over 4.5 acres of steel, with 2 words that turn every sailor who has ever worn the uniform into a statue. Attention on deck. The deck snapped upright. Not some of it. All of it. Reds and purples and browns and yellows, chiefs and airmen and the officers who had turned away. Every one of them came to attention where they stood, because that is what those words do. They reach into the spine and pull it straight before the mind has finished hearing them. Corbett's swim buddies snapped too. Pratt's phone came down to his side, forgotten, still filming the non-skid. Through the sudden stillness came a party of officers, moving fast and clean from the island, and at the head of them walked a man with 2 stars on his collar and a face that had command written into every line of it. Rear Admiral Errol Shaw, 54, the strike group commander, crossed his flight deck straight toward the woman in the blue windbreaker, and he did not slow, and he did not look at Corbett, and he did not look at anyone but her. The 1MC was still speaking. The arrival honors rolled out over the ship, formal and unhurried, and then came the words that took the last of the color out of Zane Corbett's face. A name and a title carried to every corner of the ship. The incoming commanding officer arriving. Admiral Shaw stopped 3 feet from the woman, came to attention, and raised his hand in a salute so crisp it could have cut the wind. Captain Locke, he said, warm as sunlight, loud enough to carry. Welcome aboard your ship, ma'am. He saluted her first. A rear admiral, 2 stars, saluted the woman with the clipboard first, because rank is rank, but a ship's commanding officer arriving aboard is owed her honors, and because Errol Shaw had read her record and knew precisely whose hand he was raising his to. Zane Corbett's face went through its stations one at a time, and the whole deck watched it happen. First confusion. Why is the admiral saluting the tourist? Then disbelief, a small shake of the head. No. Then recognition, arriving all at once and from every direction. The clipboard, the calm, the way she had read his deck better than he could, the half-step out of the fuel line, the words about the fouled 6-pack, the eyes that had not flinched when he shoved her into the rail, and last, when there was nowhere left to go, horror, pure and cold and total, the understanding crashing down on him that the woman he had knocked around all morning, the woman he had shoved twice and hauled by the arm and called nobody's captain, was the commanding officer of the ship he was standing on, a decorated combat aviator with a silver star, and that a full flight deck and a 2-star admiral had just watched him put his hands on her. "Captain?" Corbett said. It came out of him barely above a whisper, cracked in the middle. Beside him, Silas Rourke came to attention and brought his hand up in a salute he had been carrying for 17 years, and there was something in the old Master Chief's face that was not triumph and not relief, but something closer to reverence, the settling of a very old debt. Captain Serena Locke returned the Admiral's salute. Then she turned, unhurried, and returned Rourke's, and held the old chief's eyes for 1/2 second longer than the courtesy required, and in that half-second, 17 years passed between them without a word. Then she let her hand fall. The deck was silent but for the wind and the low idle of the turbines. 200 people stood at attention around a woman in a blue windbreaker, and no one moved. Locke turned her calm, unreadable gaze on Zane Corbett for the first time since he had knocked the clipboard from her hands, and she said nothing at all. She simply looked at him, and her silence was worse than any words she could have chosen, because it left him alone inside his own understanding with nowhere to hide, and every second of it stretched out in front of the whole ship. He would have taken shouting. Shouting, he understood. Shouting was a thing done to you that you could brace against, and, in some corner of yourself, resent. But she did not shout, and she did not gloat, and she did not so much as let a flicker of triumph cross her face. She only looked at him with those flat, calm, seen-everything eyes, and the look said nothing, and therefore said all of it. That she had known who she was the whole time he had been laughing, that his contempt had never once touched her, that the entire morning had been a thing happening to him and not to her, and that he had been the only one on the deck who did not understand the joke. 200 people watched a young man learn in silence the exact dimensions of what he had done, and there was not a sound on that deck but the wind and the turbines, and, somewhere far off, the cry of a gull that had followed the ship out to sea. The reckoning came fast, the way it does when a chain of command has watched one of its own disgrace it. A hard-moving lieutenant commander broke from the edge of the crowd. Cyrus Beck, 44, the embarked SEAL troop commander who had heard in 90 seconds what had happened on the roof and had come at a near run. He took in the scene in one sweep: the admiral, the captain, the clipboard on the deck, his own man ashen at the rail, and his face closed like a hatch. "Petty Officer Corbett," Beck said, and his voice did not rise, which made it worse. "You put your hands on a combat aviator and the commanding officer of this ship, on her own flight deck, in front of her crew." He let that sit one full beat. "You're relieved. You're done up here. Report below, and do not so much as look at this deck again until I send for you." Corbett opened his mouth and found nothing in it. His swim buddies had stepped back from him by a foot each, the small physical arithmetic of men putting distance between themselves and a thing that is finished. Pratt had put his phone away entirely. Corbett braced himself. He knew, everyone standing there knew, that Captain Locke could end him with a sentence. A word from her, and his career was ash. He had struck her. There were 200 witnesses and a video. He stood at the rail and waited for the woman he had wronged to close her hand. She did not close her hand. Honor the ones who carry it in silence. Subscribe to the veteran vault, and let this captain's story find the people who need it. Captain Locke looked at the young SEAL a moment longer, and when she spoke, it was not to him, but to Beck, and it was quiet. "He's young," she said. "Let him carry this. Don't let him lose everything to it." She bent, unhurried, and picked her clipboard up off the deck herself before anyone could do it for her, and squared the papers. "A man learns more from a debt he has to live with than from a career he doesn't. Temper the hammer, Commander." Beck's jaw worked. He had been ready to bring the full weight, and here was the person most wronged asking him to bank the fire. He gave a single tight nod. "Ma'am." It was, in its way, the hardest thing she did all morning. Harder than absorbing the shove, harder than the silence, because mercy given from strength costs more than any blow. Corbett understood it. You could see it land on him worse than any punishment. The understanding that she had every right to destroy him, and had chosen, deliberately, to let him live with what he had done instead. He would carry that longer than a discharge. Some men are broken by consequences. A few are remade by mercy. Time would tell which one Zane Corbett was, but he had been given the chance, and he knew exactly who had given it to him. Around them, the deck began, by degrees, to breathe again. Young Wade Trumbull, the blue shirt who had looked at his boots when it mattered, came forward now, while the officers spoke and knelt to gather the last of the scattered papers the wind had pushed against a chalk. He brought them to her with both hands, the way you hand something to someone you have decided, in the space of one morning, that you would follow anywhere. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm sorry. I should have said something." Locke took the papers and looked at him, and something in her face eased, just slightly. "You're saying it now," she said. "This deck is going to need men who speak up before the Admiral has to. Be one of them." She said his name off the tape on his jersey, Trumbull, and he stood a little straighter under it than he had stood all cruise, and he would remember that too, longer than he remembered the shame. That afternoon, in the ceremony she had come aboard early to walk her deck before, Captain Serena Locke took command of the ship. She read her orders in a clean, unhurried voice, and the deck full of sailors, who had watched a seal shove her into a rail that morning, stood in their dress uniforms and understood exactly what kind of officer they had gotten. Rourke stood in the front rank of the chief's mess with his chin up. He did not smile, but something in him that had stood at a strange, unfinished angle for 17 years had finally come level. Word of the morning had gone through the ship the way word always goes through a ship, faster than any message traffic, and by the time she stood at the podium, there was not a sailor aboard who did not know the story. It changed the way they listened to her. A crew will give a new captain obedience on the first day because they must. Respect has to be earned over months, sometimes over a whole cruise. Captain Locke had earned hers before she read the first line of her orders, and she had earned it not by anything she did, but by everything she declined to do. By the shove she had absorbed without a word. By the young man she had chosen not to destroy. Sailors understand strength. They are surrounded by machines that make ordinary strength look small. What they do not always get to see is strength that holds its hand. They had seen it that morning on their own deck, and it had told them everything they needed to know about the woman who would carry their ship and their lives from this day forward. At last light, when the ceremony was done and the ship was hers, Captain Locke walked to the deck edge rail alone. The sea ran gold and gray under a lowering sun, and out ahead of the ship, a squadron came home. She watched them turn into the break overhead, 4 jets in tight formation against the failing light, and she found, without meaning to, the number 2 slot, the wingman slot, off the leader's right wing, and she held her eyes on it as the flight came around. There was a young pilot flying it now, someone's son or daughter, alive and whole and unaware of anything but the numbers and the sky. But for one long moment, to the woman at the rail, the slot held a different pilot, a quiet man named Gideon Frost, 26 forever, who had flown her wing into a valley of fire because she went, and had not come out of the sky. She did not weep. She had spent 17 years past that. She only stood, straight and still against the rail, and watched the wingman's slot hold formation in the last of the light, full of the sky and empty of the man it had once held, and she carried him the way she carried everything, quietly, without a word, as her own. Below her, on the deck he had run for 30 years, an old Master Chief looked up at the small figure at the rail, and let out a long breath he felt as though he had been holding since 2009, and was, at last, at ease. Some warriors fade quietly into the years, but the valor never leaves them. Honor the ones who carry it in silence. Thank you for staying and watching. Subscribe to the Veteran Vault for more.